Walk through any historic cemetery in the northeast of the United States on a late autumn afternoon, and you will find yourself surrounded by an overwhelming display of absolute permanence. The air is cold, but the stone is colder. You see weeping angels with wings so delicately feathered they appear ready to catch the slightest wind. You run your hand across towering obelisks of gray granite, feeling the sharp, deliberate grooves of letters that have defied rain, snow, and time for more than a century. Every single monument here was designed with a singular, desperate human purpose: to ensure that a name, a life, and a memory would never be erased from the earth. We read these names. We trace the dates of birth and the dates of passing. We see the final testaments of generals, politicians, wealthy merchants, and beloved matriarchs. Yet, if you look closely at the base of these magnificent, towering sculptures, you will notice a haunting absence. Among the millions of letters meticulously hammered into the rock, the signature of the man who actually carved it is almost never there. They gave eternity to strangers. They received absolute anonymity in return. How many strikes of a heavy iron mallet does it take to shape a block of jagged stone into the soft folds of a mourning veil? It is not a question of dozens or even hundreds. It is a matter of millions of precise, bone-jarring impacts, echoing through cavernous wooden sheds 6 days a week, 10 hours a day. Our records show that by the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the epicenter of this relentless rhythm was a single, bustling town in New England, Barre, Vermont. It was confidently crowned the Granite Capital of the world. The hills surrounding the town were essentially hollowed out, yielding massive, flawless blocks of gray stone that were loaded onto reinforced rail cars and sent down into the valley. Waiting in the valley was an army of men. They were immigrants who had crossed oceans with nothing but the clothes on their backs and the centuries-old techniques of their ancestors in their hands. They came from the mountainous regions of northern Italy, from the rugged coasts of Scotland, and from the deep quarries of Spain. They did not speak the same languages, but they all understood the unforgiving language of the stone. We look at these immaculate cemeteries today and see peaceful resting places. But what does it take to breathe in the pulverized remnants of the earth, day after day, crafting a masterpiece of grief for a family you will never meet, while an invisible, jagged dust silently hardens your own lungs? They were the invisible hands that sculpted America's collective memory. No one wrote their names down in the grand history books of American industry. No one warned them that the very material granting immortality to others would soon demand their own lives as payment. Before Barre became a sprawling industrial powerhouse of dust and noise, the tradition of carving American memories began on a much smaller, quieter scale. In the 1640s, Puritan stonecutters like George Griswold were already shaping the landscape of early New England death. They worked mostly with softer, more forgiving materials, slate and sandstone, using basic iron chisels and heavy wooden mallets. Their work was stark and deeply symbolic, featuring winged soul effigies and grim hourglasses meant to warn the living of their inevitable end. Griswold and his contemporaries spent days hunched over flat slabs in the freezing coastal winds, yet they established a silent rule that would haunt the profession for centuries. The artist must remain invisible. Their names were intentionally left off the final product. It was a humble, physically taxing trade, meant to serve divine memory, not personal legacy. But America was growing rapidly, and its appetite for permanence was growing with it. Slate chipped easily. Sandstone eroded under the harsh Atlantic rains. The wealthy families of the expanding American Republic did not want their legacies washing away in a mere century. They demanded a stone that could withstand the apocalypse. They demanded granite. Granite is born from ancient volcanic fire. It is an igneous rock, densely packed with quartz and feldspar, making it one of the hardest, most unyielding natural substances on Earth. Carving it is not like carving marble or wood. You do not simply slice into granite. You must fracture it, crush it, and violently persuade it to take shape. To meet this massive new demand for indestructible monuments, The quiet, humble trade of the Puritans had to be fully industrialized. The quarries of Barre, Vermont, sat on one of the purest, most massive deposits of flawless gray granite in the world. But extracting it from the earth and shaping it into delicate angels required an army. An army that America did not yet possess. The call went out across the Atlantic Ocean. By the late 19th century, steamship agents and quarry recruiters were plastering advertisements in the town squares of northern Italy, the rugged highlands of Scotland, and the deep, rocky valleys of Spain. They promised steady wages, endless work, and limitless stone. The craftsmen answered. Thousands of men packed whatever hand tools they could carry, leaving behind the sun-drenched marble quarries of Carrara and the ancient stonemason guilds of Aberdeen. They endured weeks in the cramped, stifling steerage compartments of ocean liners, trading the world they knew for a freezing valley in northern New England. Imagine stepping off a train into the brutal, biting cold of a Vermont winter, the snow piled high against thin wooden boarding houses, with only a few dollars in your pocket and absolutely no understanding of the English language. But these men did not need English to survive. They brought with them centuries of ancestral knowledge, a profound, almost genetic understanding of how to read the hidden grain of a stone. When a Scottish or Italian carver looked at a raw, jagged block of Barre granite, he did not see an immovable obstacle. He saw the exact microscopic angle at which a steel chisel needed to strike to shear off a perfectly flat face. They transformed Barre from a sleepy farming village into a booming, deafening metropolis. The air smelled constantly of ozone from struck metal and crushed rock. The clinking of tens of thousands of chisels hitting stone rang out from dawn until dusk, echoing off the valley walls like a perpetual hailstorm. What happens when a sacred, multi-generational art form collides with the ruthless efficiency of an American industrial boom? The answer was a breathtaking, exhausting explosion of production. These immigrant sculptors were no longer carving one simple gravestone a month. They were building massive, towering mausoleums, intricate Celtic crosses, and life-size statues of grieving widows, turning the cemeteries of major cities into sprawling outdoor museums of European mastery. They poured their heritage into every delicate fold of stone fabric. Yet, at the end of a grueling 10-hour shift, when their hands were blistered and their joints throbbed from the vibrating shock of the hammer, they walked back to crowded, poorly insulated boarding houses in the freezing shadows of the quarries. They were building indestructible palaces for the dead, while shivering in wooden shacks themselves. To understand the magnitude of what these men achieved, you must step inside one of the manufacturing sheds in Barre, Vermont, around the year 1910. These were not the quiet, sunlit studios of classical European artists. These were massive, sprawling, drafty wooden structures built directly adjacent to the rail lines. Inside, the noise was absolute and all-consuming. Hundreds of men stood shoulder to shoulder, separated by only a few feet, each hunched over a massive block of gray granite. The air constantly vibrated. In the dead of a New England winter, when temperatures plunged well below freezing, the sheds offered little protection from the biting wind. The men wore heavy wool coats, thick caps, and stiff gloves, yet their hands had to remain remarkably steady. They had to be steady enough to carve a perfect, paper-thin rose petal out of one of the hardest natural rocks on the planet. The true masters of this chaotic environment were the Italian immigrants. Many of them hailed from the legendary stone-working regions of northern Italy, places like Viggiu and Carrara, where sculpting was not merely a job, but a generational inheritance. When a wealthy family in New York or Boston ordered a custom monument, a weeping angel draped in mourning clothes, a life-sized portrait of a lost child, or an intricate Celtic cross, the raw stone was handed over to these Italian carvers. They did not rely on modern technology or precise lasers. They worked entirely from plaster models, using their eyes, their hands, and a deeply ingrained geometric intuition to translate a two-dimensional idea into a three-dimensional masterpiece. They could spend weeks on a single statue, coaxing incredible softness out of a material forged in volcanic heat. They were artists in every sense of the word, but they were treated as factory laborers. For decades, their physical process remained largely unchanged. A man held a steel chisel in his left hand and a heavy iron mallet in his right. He swung, he struck, and a small chip of stone flew off. It was rhythmic, exhausting, and undeniably slow. But as the 20th century dawned, the American appetite for these grand, indestructible monuments skyrocketed. The industry suddenly demanded more speed, more volume, and more intricate details than human hands could naturally provide. The solution arrived in the form of compressed air. The invention and widespread adoption of the pneumatic carving tool completely transformed the granite industry. This was a handheld mechanical hammer connected to a high-pressure rubber hose. Instead of a man swinging a mallet 60 times a minute, the compressed air drove the steel chisel into the stone at a staggering rate of 3,000 to 6,000 blows per minute. Holding one of these early pneumatic tools was like wrestling with a localized earthquake. The sheer, violent vibration traveled up the carver's fingers, through his wrists, and deep into his shoulders. Over time, the constant shock waves damaged the nerves and blood vessels in their hands, leading to a condition they quietly referred to as dead fingers. A chilling whitening and numbness that made it difficult to even feel the stone they were shaping. Yet they kept carving. The pneumatic drill allowed them to undercut the stone with breathtaking precision, creating dark shadows and depths that were previously impossible. They could carve the delicate, overlapping lace of a woman's dress or the individual feathers of an eagle's wing in a fraction of the time. But this mechanical miracle brought with it an invisible curse. When a traditional mallet strikes a chisel, the stone fractures into heavy chips and flakes that fall harmlessly to the floor. When a pneumatic drill strikes granite several thousand times a minute, it does not just break the stone, pulverizes it. The rapid-fire impact ground the quartz-rich granite into a microscopic, flour-like powder. The high-pressure exhaust air from the tool then blew this powder directly outward, right into the face of the working carver. Almost overnight, the atmosphere inside the manufacturing sheds changed. The sheds were transformed into blinding, suffocating snowstorms of fine white dust. It settled heavily on their hair, their eyebrows, and their clothes until every man looked like a pale, moving ghost. It coated the wooden beams and piled up in thick drifts on the floor, tasted like dry, bitter chalk on their tongues. And with every single breath they took, for 10 hours a day, they inhaled it deep into their bodies. They were using the air to carve the stone, without realizing the stone was silently claiming their air. What does it take to maintain a steady hand for the sake of a stranger's memory, when every breath you take is slowly filling your lungs with microscopic glass? The dust that filled the manufacturing sheds in Barre was not ordinary dirt. It was granite dust, and granite is exceptionally rich in quartz. When you pulverize quartz with a pneumatic drill striking several thousand times a minute, you create microscopic particles of silica. To the naked human eye, it looked like a soft, harmless white powder floating in the cold shafts of winter sunlight. But if you were to put that same dust under a microscope, you would see something entirely different. You would see millions of jagged, microscopic shards of glass. When a carver inhaled this dust, those tiny, razor-sharp particles traveled down his windpipe and embedded themselves deep into the delicate, oxygen-exchanging sacs of his lungs. The human body is remarkably resilient, but it has no natural defense against stone. The immune system would send cells to attack the foreign invaders, but the silica would simply destroy those cells. The body's only remaining option was to build thick, rigid scar tissue around the shards to contain the internal damage. Slowly, relentlessly, the soft, flexible tissue of the lungs turned into something hard and unyielding. The men were quite literally turning to stone from the inside out. The medical establishment eventually gave it a formal name, silicosis, but the men in the sheds simply called it the stonecutters' consumption, or the White Death. It did not happen overnight. It was a slow, agonizing theft of a man's breath, It always began as a dry, persistent cough in the morning. Then came the sudden shortness of breath after climbing a short flight of wooden stairs to their boarding rooms. Eventually, a master sculptor in his prime, a man with forearms thick as tree branches from years of swinging heavy iron mallets, would find himself utterly unable to walk across a room without gasping for air. The statistics buried in the historical records of this era are almost impossible to comprehend. According to mortality data from the period, there was a time when a staggering 73% of stonecutters perished from silicotuberculosis, a fatal, inevitable combination of the weakened, scarred lungs becoming infected with the tuberculosis bacteria. The average life expectancy of these incredibly skilled artisans dropped dramatically, falling roughly 11 years below that of other adult men living in the exact same state of Vermont. They were brilliant artists dying in their 30s and 40s, coughing up blood into handkerchiefs long before their hair even had the chance to turn gray. This slow-motion tragedy reached a horrifying climax in the autumn of 1918. As the Spanish flu pandemic swept across the globe, it eventually found its way into the cold, isolated granite towns of New England. For a healthy person, the virus was a brutal ordeal. For a granite carver whose lungs were already severely compromised, heavily riddled with silica and thick scar tissue, the virus was a rapid, absolute death sentence. The devastation was swift and merciless. In a span of just 3 weeks during that autumn, over 100 stone workers in Barre succumbed to the illness. The men who had spent their entire lives carving headstones for others were suddenly dying so fast that the town struggled to bury them. What is the true cost of an indestructible legacy? These immigrants stood in freezing sheds, inhaling pulverized quartz 10 hours a day, pouring their absolute genius into weeping angels and towering obelisks for the wealthiest families in America. They guaranteed eternity for strangers. But when their own lungs finally gave out, their bodies broken and exhausted, many of them were buried in quiet, modest graves, leaving their widows and children destitute in a foreign land. They sacrificed their own brief, fragile lives to buy immortality for people they would never even meet. The men working in the granite sheds of Barre, Vermont, were not passive victims waiting for the White Death to take them. They were immensely proud artisans, and as they watched their brothers, fathers, and sons waste away, their grief hardened into a fierce, collective anger. They understood the stone, and now they deeply understood the invisible physics of the dust that was killing them. They did not ask to stop carving. They simply asked for the right to breathe while they did it. The Granite Cutters International Association stepped into the forefront of a grueling, decades-long battle against the quarry owners and shed operators. Their primary demand was not for shorter hours or significantly higher pay, though those elements were constantly debated. Their most desperate demand was for ventilation. They wanted powerful suction equipment installed directly over the pneumatic carving tools, a mechanical way to pull the pulverized silica away from a man's face before he could draw it into his lungs. It seems like a basic human necessity today. Yet, the fight to secure this single piece of life-saving equipment dragged on for a staggering 30 years. 30 years. Think about what 30 years means inside a freezing granite shed. That is an entire generation of master sculptors. It meant 30 years of men coming to work in the pre-dawn dark, switching on their high-pressure hoses, and willingly walking into a suffocating blizzard of glass. It meant 30 years of bitter strikes that depleted their meager savings, intense labor negotiations, and funerals. So many funerals. The local union halls became places of both fierce resistance and profound mourning. Finally, in the year 1938, a historic turning point was reached. Following relentless pressure from the union and mounting undeniable medical evidence regarding silicosis, a mandatory agreement was forged. The granite manufacturing sheds in Barre were forced to install comprehensive local exhaust ventilation systems. Massive rubber hoses and powerful vacuum hoods were lowered directly over the workspaces. When the pneumatic drills roared to life, the lethal white clouds were instantly pulled up and away, vented safely out of the wooden structures. For the first time in nearly half a century, A carver could look down the length of a massive shed and actually see the man working at the opposite end. The air cleared. The White Death was finally deprived of its primary weapon. It was a monumental victory for the American labor movement. But for the men who had already spent a decade or more wielding the pneumatic chisels, the victory arrived entirely too late. What does it mean to win a war when the fatal casualties are already living inside your own chest? The silica was already permanently embedded in their lungs. The rigid scar tissue had already formed. They had fought for and won the right to clean air for the next generation, but they would still slowly suffocate on the dust of the past. When we trace our bare hands over the intricate, flawless carvings in historic cemeteries from New York to Chicago, we are touching the exact moments when these manual laborers traded their breath for our memory. The weeping angels, the draped urns, and the towering, indestructible obelisks still stand perfectly intact against the rain and the snow. They have not eroded. They have not faded. The wealthy families who commissioned these magnificent monuments secured exactly what they paid for: absolute, enduring permanence. The names carved deeply into the polished granite faces will be remembered for centuries. Yet the hands that struck the chisels are gone. The names of the Italian, Scottish, and Spanish immigrants who designed and executed these masterpieces are missing from the pedestals. They left behind a sprawling, breathtaking gallery of grief that covers the entire United States, an open-air museum of unmatched European craftsmanship. But they left this magnificent physical legacy completely anonymously. The next time you find yourself walking through a historic cemetery, perhaps on a quiet, overcast afternoon, stop for a moment before one of those towering granite monuments. Look closely at the weeping angels, the finely draped urns, and the intricate floral patterns carved with impossible precision into the unyielding rock. The silence of the graveyard is profound and peaceful, but it is a deeply deceptive silence. To truly understand what you are looking at, you must mentally replace that quietness with the deafening, earth-shaking roar of the manufacturing sheds in Barre, Vermont. You must imagine the biting, sub-zero cold of a New England winter, the heavy iron mallets, the violently vibrating pneumatic drills, and the blinding, suffocating white clouds of pulverized quartz that filled the air. These magnificent structures were not simply purchased. They were paid for twice. First, they were paid for by the immense wealth of the powerful families who commissioned them. But the second, far heavier payment was exacted in human breath. The Italian, Scottish, and Spanish immigrants who crossed oceans to swing those chisels paid the ultimate price. They traded the soft, vital tissues of their own lungs for the cold, hard permanence of a stranger's memory. It is a haunting, devastating irony that men who dedicated their entire waking lives to the business of eternal remembrance were themselves completely forgotten by the society they helped to build. They engineered indestructible monuments to immortality, yet they were not granted the basic dignity of breathing clean air. Their names are not etched into the base of the statues. There are no grand plaques in the historic cemeteries of Boston, New York, or Chicago to honor the stonecutters who died in their 30s and 40s, coughing up their lives in cramped, freezing wooden boarding houses. Their true monument is the very landscape of American mourning. Every flawless curve in the granite, every sharp, distinct letter that has survived a century of driving rain and snow, is a testament to their unmatched European skill and their quiet, tragic sacrifice. They are the invisible architects of eternity, physically holding up the history of others while slipping quietly into the shadows themselves. When you look at these grand sculptures today, what do you see? Do you see the wealthy industrialist whose name is proudly displayed on the polished front? Or do you see the nameless immigrant whose hands bled and whose lungs hardened to carve it? How should we, as a society, properly remember the people who gave their very lives to build the permanent monuments of others? Share your thoughts with us in the comments below. If you believe these forgotten stories deserve to be brought back into the light, please subscribe to LostWorld. We will continue to uncover the hidden, human sacrifices that built the world we live in today. This video is based on historical records, archival research, and published sources. Where individual records were not preserved, details reflect documented patterns of the era rather than specific named accounts. Sources referenced in this video are listed in the description.